September 13th, 1944. The morning mist clung to the Dutch countryside like a shroud as Martinus Josephus Kuiper stood at the window of his farmhouse, watching the distant columns of Wehrmacht troops moving along the road toward Arnhem. He was 53 years old, a farmer who had spent his entire life working the same plot of land his father and grandfather had tended before him. His hands were calloused from decades of plowing fields and repairing fences, not from holding weapons. Yet in less than 72 hours, this unremarkable Dutch farmer would find himself at the center of a military engagement that would alter the course of Operation Market Garden and save the lives of hundreds of British paratroopers. He would face down 3,000 German soldiers with nothing but determination, intimate knowledge of his own land, and a willingness to sacrifice everything he had built over 5 decades. What happened in those 3 days defied every principle of military logic. One civilian farmer against a reinforced German battalion. No military training, no support, no weapons beyond a hunting rifle and his own ingenuity. The outcome should have been obvious. Kuiper should have been swept aside, arrested, or killed within hours. Instead, his actions would delay a crucial German reinforcement column long enough to change the tactical situation at Arnhem Bridge. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Where Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion was fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. This was not heroism born from a lifetime of military service. This was the desperate resistance of a man who understood that sometimes the most ordinary people must do extraordinary things, not because they are trained for it, not because they seek glory, but simply because no one else is there to do it. The path to this impossible moment began not with Martinus Kuiper's birth, but with the German invasion of the Netherlands on May 10th, 1940. The Dutch military, though brave and determined, was overwhelmed in just 5 days. The bombing of Rotterdam on May 14th killed nearly 900 civilians and destroyed the city's historic centre. Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch government fled to London. The Netherlands, a nation that had remained neutral in World War I, fell under Nazi occupation. For Kuiper and millions of other Dutch civilians, the occupation meant a slow descent into hardship and fear. The Germans initially presented themselves as benevolent occupiers, respecting Dutch culture and promising minimal interference. That facade crumbled quickly. By 1942, forced labour conscription began. Dutch men were shipped to Germany to work in factories and mines. Jewish neighbours disappeared overnight, loaded onto trains heading east. Food became scarce as the Germans requisitioned Dutch agricultural production for their own war effort. Kuiper's farm, located near the village of Driel in the province of Gelderland, provided a modest living for his family. He grew potatoes, wheat, and vegetables. He kept dairy, cows, and chickens. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations, a legacy he intended to pass to his own children. Under German occupation, that legacy became increasingly precarious. Wehrmacht officers requisitioned portions of his harvest. German soldiers sometimes used his fields for training exercises, trampling crops without compensation. Kuiper watched his life's work slowly eroded by an occupying force that treated Dutch farmers as resources to be exploited. Yet Kuiper, like many Dutch farmers, engaged in quiet resistance when possible. He hid extra grain to feed neighbours whose rations were insufficient. He sheltered a Jewish family in his barn for 3 weeks in 1943 until they could be moved to a safer location. These were not acts of military defiance. They were the moral choices of a decent man living under tyranny, small rebellions that cost nothing but could save lives. By September 1944, the strategic situation in Western Europe had shifted dramatically. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6th had succeeded beyond initial expectations. American, British, and Canadian forces broke out of the beachhead and swept across France. Paris was liberated on August 25th. The German armies that had conquered France in 1940 were now retreating in disorder toward the German border. For the first time since 1940, Dutch civilians dared to hope that liberation was coming. British forces reached the Belgian border in early September. Radio broadcasts from London spoke of a massive airborne operation planned to seize bridges across the Netherlands and create a corridor for Allied tanks to drive into Germany. The operation was codenamed Market Garden. Its architect, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, believed it could end the war by Christmas. The plan was ambitious to the point of audacity. 3 airborne divisions, the American 101st and 82nd Airborne, plus the British 1st Airborne, would parachute and glide into the Netherlands on September 17th. They would capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British XXX Corps, a massive armoured formation, would then drive north along a single elevated highway, crossing each captured bridge in sequence and thrust deep into Germany. Arnhem Bridge was the final objective, the farthest north, the one that opened the door into the industrial Ruhr region of Germany. If the Allies could seize and hold Arnhem Bridge, the war might indeed end by Christmas. But if the operation failed at Arnhem, the entire Market Garden plan would collapse. The bridge at Arnhem was 64 miles behind German lines. The British 1st Airborne Division, tasked with capturing it, would be isolated and vulnerable until XXX Corps arrived to relieve them. Martinus Kuiper knew none of this. Strategic planning, as he worked his farm in mid-September. He knew only what he could see. German troops moving through the area in increasing numbers, supply convoys heading north, defensive positions being reinforced. Something was happening. The Germans were preparing for something. The tension was palpable even to a farmer who spent his days concerned with crop yields and livestock health. On September 16th, a German reconnaissance battalion arrived in Driel and the surrounding area. These were not regular Wehrmacht infantry. They were veteran troops from the 9th SS Panzer Division, men who had fought on the Eastern Front and survived the brutal combat against Soviet forces. Their commander, SS Sturmbannführer Heinz Harmel, was a professional soldier who understood the importance of controlling river crossings and key terrain. The Germans began establishing defensive positions along the southern bank of the lower Rhine River, directly across from Arnhem. They commandeered buildings, dug trenches, and positioned anti-aircraft guns. Kuiper watched them work, his resentment building. These soldiers were preparing to fight on his land, in his fields, using his farm as part of their defensive line. Everything he had built over 5 decades would become a battlefield. On the morning of September 17th, Kuiper heard aircraft engines unlike anything he had experienced before. The sound was immense, a low rumbling thunder that seemed to fill the entire sky. He stepped outside and looked up to see hundreds of transport planes flying overhead, black silhouettes against the blue sky, each towing 1 or 2 gliders. American C-47, Skytrains, British Sterlings and Dakotas, wave after wave in perfect formation. Then the sky bloomed with parachutes, hundreds of them, white and camouflage green, drifting down like seeds from some impossible tree. Allied paratroopers were landing in the Netherlands. Liberation had arrived. Dutch civilians across the country erupted in joy. People who had endured 4 years of occupation waved at the descending paratroopers, offered them food and water, guided them to German positions. But the joy was premature. The Germans had not abandoned the Netherlands. They were reinforcing. And critically, 2 SS Panzer divisions that Allied intelligence had believed were depleted and no longer combat effective were, in fact, refitting and resting in the Arnhem area when Market Garden began. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped into a hornet's nest. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion managed to reach the northern end of Arnhem Bridge on September 17th and dug in. They held the bridge against mounting German attacks, waiting for XXX Corps to arrive and relieve them. But XXX Corps was delayed. The single highway they needed to advance along became a killing ground. German resistance at Eindhoven and Nijmegen was fiercer than expected. The relief column crawled forward, hours, behind schedule, then days. Frost's men at Arnhem Bridge were surrounded, outnumbered, running low on ammunition and medical supplies. They fought with desperate courage, turning buildings around the bridge into fortresses, holding out against German armor and infantry that should have overwhelmed them in hours. But by September 20th, their situation had become unsustainable. They needed help. They needed reinforcements. They needed a miracle. That miracle would come not from military planning or superior firepower, but from a 53-year-old Dutch farmer who decided that if no one else would help the British paratroopers, he would do what he could with what he had. On September 19th, German troops arrived at Kuiper's farm in force. An SS captain informed him that his property was being requisitioned for military use. His farmhouse would serve as a command post. His barn would house ammunition and supplies. His fields would be used as assembly areas for troops, preparing to move north to Arnhem. Kuiper listened to these orders with an outward appearance of submission. Inside, his mind was calculating. If German reinforcements were assembling on his farm before moving north to attack the British paratroopers at Arnhem, then anything that delayed those reinforcements would help the British. He did not think of himself as a soldier or a resistance fighter. He thought of himself as a man who had one chance to do something meaningful, and if he failed, he would lose everything anyway. That evening, after the Germans had settled into his farmhouse, Kuiper went to his barn. The Germans had stacked crates of ammunition and supplies there, but had not yet posted guards. They assumed a Dutch farmer posed no threat. That assumption would prove costly. Kuiper knew his land better than any German soldier could. He knew every drainage ditch, every field boundary, every route through his property. He knew where the ground was soft enough to bog down, vehicles. He knew where the old stone walls and hedgerows created natural choke points, and he knew how to make small changes that would seem like accidents but would have significant consequences. He started with the simplest sabotage imaginable. He opened the gate to his cow pasture and drove his dairy cows onto the road the Germans would use to move troops north. Cows are not intelligent animals in the sense of planning or strategy, but they are stubborn and slow-moving. A herd of 24 cows blocking a road will delay a military convoy for 30 to 40 minutes, while soldiers try to move them aside. It was a small delay, insignificant in isolation, but Kuiper understood that in military operations, small delays compound into larger ones. The next morning, September 20th, a German supply convoy tried to move through Kuiper's property toward Arnhem. The drivers found the road blocked by cows. Soldiers dismounted to clear the animals. While they were distracted, Kuiper approached the convoy's lead vehicle and, with a casual movement that looked like an accident, knocked the fuel cap off the tank. Gasoline spilled onto the ground. The driver shouted at him in German. Kuiper apologized profusely in Dutch, playing the role of a clumsy farmer. The Germans cursed him and spent another 20 minutes dealing with the fuel spill. These were pinprick attacks, nuisance delays. Any one of them would have been dismissed as an accident or the incompetence of a stupid farmer. But Kuiper kept finding ways to cause problems. He damaged a section of fence so that when German half-tracks drove through his fields, the fence wire tangled in their tracks and forced them to stop for repairs. He told German officers that certain fields were dry and suitable for vehicle movement when he knew the ground was still waterlogged from recent rain. Trucks and cars got stuck, requiring precious time to extract them. By September 21st, German officers were becoming suspicious. Too many delays, too many accidents, too many problems occurring on one farmer's property. An SS Hauptsturmführer, a captain, confronted Kuiper directly. He accused him of sabotage. Kuiper denied it calmly. He was just a farmer. These were accidents. The stress of war made people see conspiracy where there was only bad luck. The captain did not believe him, but had no proof. And more importantly, the captain had orders to get his troops to Arnhem immediately. Frost's paratroopers were still holding the bridge, preventing German forces from using it to reinforce their positions. Every hour the British held out was another hour for XXX Corps to advance. The German High Command was screaming for reinforcements to overwhelm the British position. The captain could not afford to waste time investigating a farmer when he needed to be moving troops. That afternoon, Kuiper made his boldest move yet. The Germans had stored ammunition crates in his barn, planning to move them north. The following morning, Kuiper waited until evening, when the guards were eating dinner, and entered the barn. He did not try to destroy the ammunition. An explosion would kill him and accomplish nothing except alerting the Germans to his sabotage. Instead, he did something simpler and more effective. He carefully loosened the lids on multiple ammunition crates. Then he removed several belts of machine gun ammunition and hid them in his fields. Not enough that the missing ammunition would be immediately obvious, but enough that when German troops opened those crates under fire in Arnhem, they would find themselves short of ammunition exactly when they needed it most. He also deliberately mixed ammunition types in some crates, rifle cartridges in machine gun cans, pistol rounds in rifle bandoliers. Small acts of chaos that would cause confusion and delay when Germans were trying to resupply under pressure. These sabotage efforts were incredibly risky. If caught, Kuiper would be executed immediately. The Germans did not tolerate resistance from civilians. Captured resistance fighters were shot or hanged as a matter of routine. Kuiper knew this. His wife begged him to stop, to not endanger their family. But Kuiper had made his decision. He would do what he could, for as long as he could, until the Germans stopped him or the British were relieved. September 22nd brought the crisis point. The British paratroopers at Arnhem Bridge had been holding their positions for 5 days, an impossible achievement against the German forces surrounding them. But they were out of ammunition, out of medical supplies, and running out of men capable of fighting. Frost himself had been wounded. The buildings they occupied were burning. German tanks were systematically destroying their defensive positions. At the same time, elements of the British 1st Airborne Division south of the Rhine, including what remained of the division after the catastrophic fighting in Arnhem, were attempting to establish a defensive perimeter in the village of Oosterbeek. They desperately needed reinforcements and supplies. The Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade was scheduled to drop on September 21st, but had been delayed by bad weather. When they finally jumped on September 22nd, they landed directly in front of German positions and took heavy casualties. Kuiper's farm sat directly in the path of German reinforcement routes to both Arnhem Bridge and Oosterbeek. His small acts of sabotage had caused cumulative delays, forcing German units to arrive piecemeal rather than in coordinated waves. This unintentional assistance to the British was about to become very intentional and very dangerous. On the evening of September 22nd, a German officer arrived at Kuiper's farmhouse with a company of infantry, approximately 150 men. The officer informed Kuiper that his farm was now the assembly point for a battalion strength force, roughly 3,000 troops, that would launch a coordinated attack on the British positions at dawn. The troops would spend the night in his fields and barn, then move out at first light. 3,000 German soldiers were about to use his property as their staging area for an attack that could annihilate what remained of the British 1st Airborne Division south of the Rhine. Kuiper faced a choice. He could do nothing, let the attack proceed, and keep himself and his family safe. Or he could try something so audacious, so unlikely to succeed, that even thinking about it seemed like madness. He chose madness. That night, while German soldiers slept in his fields and barn, Kuiper did something that no military manual would ever recommend, and no sane person would attempt. He began systematically sabotaging the German assembly. He started with the simplest act. He went to the field where the Germans had parked their transport trucks and motorcycles. Using a thin piece of wire, he punctured dozens of tires. Not slashing them, which would be immediately obvious, but creating small punctures that would cause slow leaks. By morning, when the Germans tried to move out, they would find many of their vehicles immobilized. Then he moved to the barn where officers were sleeping. He found their maps and carefully altered them. He erased key road junctions and redrew them in slightly wrong positions. He changed the markings for river crossings. He altered the grid coordinates for their attack objectives by small amounts, just enough to cause confusion without being immediately obvious as sabotage. He found supply crates marked for the morning attack and switched their contents. Medical supplies went into ammunition crates. Food rations were mixed with radio equipment. Engineering tools were placed in boxes marked as food. When these crates were distributed in the darkness before dawn, the chaos would be extraordinary. But Kuiper saved his most dangerous act for last. He knew that German artillery batteries were positioned several kilometers to his east, ready to provide fire support for the dawn attack. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Those batteries needed forward observers to direct their fire accurately. The forward observers communicated with the guns using radios and telephones. Kuiper found the telephone lines running from his farm to the artillery positions. These were field lines, laid temporarily on the ground and through hedgerows. In the darkness, he cut the lines in multiple places, then buried the cut ends under dirt and vegetation so the breaks would not be immediately obvious. When the Germans tried to call for artillery support in the morning, they would find their communications severed. They would waste time trying to find the breaks, time that could mean the difference between success and failure for their attack. By 3 a.m, Kuiper had completed his sabotage. He was exhausted, terrified, and certain he would be caught and killed. He returned to his farmhouse and sat with his wife, waiting for dawn. If his sabotage was discovered before the attack began, he was dead. If it was discovered during the attack, he was dead. His only hope was that the chaos of combat would prevent the Germans from immediately realizing what had happened, or from tracing the problems back to him. Dawn on September 23rd came grey and cold. German officers roused their troops and began organizing the attack. Almost immediately, problems arose. Dozens of vehicles had flat tires. Officers shouted for mechanics to repair them, but there were too many damaged vehicles and not enough time. The battalion commander made the decision to proceed with the attack anyway, leaving behind the immobilized vehicles and marching the troops forward on foot. Then, the supply problems became apparent. Crates were opened and found to contain the wrong equipment. Machine gun crews received boxes of medical supplies. Mortar teams found themselves carrying food rations instead of ammunition. The chaos spread through the ranks. Sergeants shouted at privates. Officers cursed the incompetence of the supply personnel who had loaded the crates. The attack was supposed to begin at dawn, approximately 6 o'clock. By 7 o'clock, the battalion was still trying to sort out its supply problems and reorganize its formations. The delay was already 1 hour. In military operations, 1 hour can be everything. It can mean the difference between attacking in darkness and attacking in daylight. It can mean the difference between surprising the enemy and giving them time to prepare. When the German troops finally began their advance toward the British positions, they found that their artillery support was not available. Forward observers tried to call fire missions and discovered their telephone lines were dead. They switched to radio and found that some of their radios were not working because the batteries had been removed, hidden. Kuiper had done this during the night, taking batteries from radios left unattended and burying them in his fields. Without artillery support, the German infantry faced British paratroopers who, despite being outnumbered and low on ammunition, were expert defensive fighters. The British had spent days fortifying their positions in Oosterbeek. They had established interlocking fields of fire. They had prepared fallback positions. And critically, they had been given 1 extra hour to prepare because of the delays caused by Kuiper's sabotage. The German attack went forward anyway. 3,000 troops advancing against perhaps 1,500 British paratroopers defending Oosterbeek. The mathematics favoured the Germans. The terrain and preparation favoured the British. What followed was brutal close-quarters combat through houses and gardens. The Germans advanced. The British fell back to secondary positions. Both sides took heavy casualties. But the German attack, which should have overrun the British positions by mid-morning, stalled. The supply confusion meant that German troops ran out of ammunition faster than expected. The lack of artillery support meant they could not suppress British defensive positions before assaulting them. The cumulative effect of all Kuiper's small acts of sabotage was a German attack that proceeded in fits and starts, lacking the coordination and overwhelming force that might have succeeded. By noon on September 23rd, the German battalion commander was furious. His attack had failed to achieve its objectives. His troops were disorganized. His supply situation was chaotic. He demanded to know what had gone wrong. His staff investigated and discovered the sabotage. Cut telephone lines, tampered supply crates, altered maps, missing radio batteries, punctured tires. Someone had systematically undermined the entire operation. The commander immediately suspected the Dutch farmer on whose property his troops had assembled. He sent soldiers to Kuiper's farmhouse to arrest him. Kuiper did not try to run. There was nowhere to run to. He stood in his doorway and waited for the German soldiers to arrive. They dragged him from his house and brought him before the battalion commander. The officer was a professional soldier, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had seen countless acts of partisan sabotage. He recognized immediately what Kuiper had done and understood how effective it had been. He also understood that executing a civilian saboteur was standard procedure under German military law. The commander asked Kuiper one question: why? Why would a farmer risk his life, his family, his property to help British soldiers he had never met? Kuiper's answer was simple: because it was right. The Germans were occupying his country, the British were trying to liberate it. He had spent 4 years watching his neighbours be arrested, his harvest confiscated, his nation humiliated. When he finally had a chance to do something, he took it, not because he was brave, but because he could not live with himself if he did nothing. The German commander ordered Kuiper executed immediately. Soldiers marched him to the edge of his property, near the fields he had worked his entire life. They prepared to shoot him. Kuiper stood calmly. He had known this would likely be the outcome. He had made peace with it during the long night of sabotage. If his actions had delayed the German attack, if they had given the British even a few extra hours to hold their positions, then his death meant something. But execution did not come. At that moment, British artillery from XXX Corps, which had finally reached the southern bank of the Rhine near Driel, opened fire on German positions. Shells began falling on Kuiper's farm and the surrounding area. The German soldiers holding Kuiper scattered for cover. In the chaos, Kuiper ran. He knew his land better than any German soldier. He knew which ditches provided cover from artillery. He knew which hedgerows concealed movement. He ran through his fields while shells exploded around him, diving into drainage ditches, crawling through mud, staying below the trajectory of the artillery fire. Behind him, German soldiers tried to pursue, but they were more concerned with surviving the artillery barrage than with capturing one farmer. Kuiper reached the southern edge of his property, crossed into neighbouring farmland, and kept running. He ran toward the British lines south of the Rhine. He ran through fields that other farmers like him had worked for generations. He ran until his lungs burned, and his legs felt like they would give out. He ran until he saw British soldiers in defensive positions along the riverbank. He stumbled into the British lines, muddy, exhausted, and barely able to speak. The British soldiers almost shot him, thinking he was a German infiltrator. He managed to gasp out in broken English that he was Dutch, that he had sabotaged German positions, that he needed help. The British brought him to their officers. Over the next hour, Kuiper told the British everything he knew about German positions, troop strengths, and planned attacks. His information was invaluable. The British had been fighting blind for days, unsure of German dispositions south of the Rhine. Kuiper's detailed knowledge of the area allowed British artillery to target German assembly areas and supply routes with precision. More importantly, Kuiper's sabotage had achieved something remarkable. The German battalion that was supposed to attack at dawn on September 23rd had been delayed for hours, had suffered supply and communication failures, and had ultimately failed to overrun British positions. That failure bought time for more Polish paratroopers to land, time for XXX Corps artillery to provide fire support, time for what remained of the British 1st Airborne Division to evacuate across the Rhine during Operation Berlin on the night of September 25th to 26th. The evacuation of Oosterbeek was a defeat. Operation Market Garden had failed. The British did not capture and hold Arnhem Bridge. The war did not end by Christmas 1944. But approximately 2,400 British and Polish soldiers escaped across the Rhine when, by all reasonable military calculations, they should have been killed or captured. Those men survived in part because of delays and disruptions in German attack plans on September 23rd, and those delays were caused by a 53-year-old Dutch farmer who spent one night systematically sabotaging 3,000 German soldiers with nothing but his knowledge of his own land and a willingness to risk everything. After the war, Kuiper returned to his farm. The buildings had been destroyed during the fighting. His fields were cratered by artillery and littered with the debris of war. It took him years to rebuild. The Dutch government awarded him the Bronze Lion, one of the highest Dutch military decorations, for his actions during Operation Market Garden. The British government awarded him the King's Medal for Courage in the cause of freedom, but Kuiper never spoke much about what he had done. When neighbours asked him about it, he would shrug and say he had just been a farmer trying to survive the war like everyone else. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a man who had been given one chance to do something meaningful and had taken it. He died in 1968 at age 77, still living on the same farm where he had sabotaged 3,000 German soldiers. His children inherited the property and continued farming it. Today, a small plaque stands near the road that runs past the farm. It commemorates the actions of Martinus Josephus Kuiper during Operation Market Garden. Most people driving past do not know the story. They see farmland, peaceful and ordinary, and have no idea that in September 1944, this place was the site of one man's impossible stand against an army. The broader story of Operation Market Garden is well known. It was the largest airborne operation in history at that time. It was a bold plan that ultimately failed. The British 1st Airborne Division suffered approximately 75% casualties. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and his battalion at Arnhem Bridge held out for 4 days before being overrun. Thousands of Dutch civilians helped Allied soldiers hide from German patrols and escape capture. The Dutch resistance provided invaluable intelligence and support, but within that larger story are smaller stories, individual acts of courage that changed outcomes in ways that are difficult to quantify. Kuiper's sabotage on September 22nd and 23rd was one of those acts. It was not strategically decisive. It did not win the battle or save the operation. But it delayed one German attack, disrupted one battalion's coordination, and bought time that helped British soldiers survive. In the final accounting of World War II, Martinus Kuiper was one civilian among hundreds of millions affected by the war. His actions were one incident among countless thousands, but his story illustrates something fundamental about resistance and courage. You do not need to be a soldier to fight tyranny. You do not need weapons or training or orders from commanders. Sometimes you just need to see an opportunity to help, understand the cost of inaction, and make the choice to do what is right regardless of the consequences. The 3,000 German soldiers who assembled on Kuiper's farm on September 22nd were professionals. They were experienced troops with good leadership, adequate equipment, and clear objectives. By every military calculation, they should have overwhelmed the British defenders at Oosterbeek in a matter of hours. But they did not account for one variable in their planning. They did not account for a farmer who refused to be passive, who understood that even small acts of sabotage could have disproportionate effects, and who was willing to risk his life for people he had never met. In the decades after the war, military historians studied Operation Market Garden extensively. They analysed the planning failures, the intelligence mistakes, the tactical decisions that led to defeat. They debated whether Montgomery's plan was flawed from the beginning or whether it could have succeeded with better execution. They documented the courage of British paratroopers who held impossible positions against overwhelming odds. But few historians paid much attention to Martinus Kuiper. He did not fit neatly into standard military narratives. He was not a soldier. He did not fight in any traditional sense. He was just a farmer who caused problems for Germans assembling on his property. His contribution to the battle seemed minor compared to the grand, strategic movements of divisions and corps. Yet that dismissal misses something essential about how wars are actually fought and won. Grand strategies depend on logistics, on supply lines, on coordinated movements of thousands of troops arriving at the right place at the right time. When those movements are delayed, when supplies are disrupted, When communications fail, the grand strategy falls apart. And sometimes those delays and disruptions are caused not by enemy armies but by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Kuiper understood this instinctively. He was not a military tactician. He could not read maps or analyze force ratios or predict German operational plans. But he understood that armies need supplies, that coordinated attacks require functioning communications, and that commanders depend on accurate information. He attacked all three of those requirements using nothing but his knowledge of his own farm and a willingness to spend one night in the dark sabotaging everything he could reach. The German battalion commander who ordered Kuiper's execution recognized what the farmer had achieved. He understood that one man with no military training had disrupted an entire battalion's attack plan. That recognition came too late to prevent the damage, but it validated what Kuiper had accomplished. He had not been dismissed as an annoyance or an incompetent civilian. He had been recognized as a genuine threat by professional soldiers who understood the military implications of his actions. When British soldiers evacuated from Oosterbeek on the night of September 25th to 26th, they left behind their wounded and their dead. They left behind equipment and weapons. They left behind a battlefield that the Germans controlled. But they escaped with their lives. Approximately 2,400 men crossed the Rhine in small boats and rafts under cover of darkness, while German artillery pounded the evacuation sites. Those men returned to England, recovered from their wounds, and many of them fought in subsequent operations. Some landed in Normandy on D-Day, plus 130. Some fought in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. Some participated in the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. Their survival at Oosterbeek meant they were available to fight in battles that ultimately led to German defeat, and their survival was due to countless small factors. The courage of Polish paratroopers who landed under fire, the artillery support from XXX Corps, the defensive positions prepared by British engineers, the leadership of officers who kept their men fighting when surrender seemed inevitable, and the sabotage of one Dutch farmer who delayed one German attack on one critical day. Kuiper never claimed credit for saving British lives. He never quantified how many soldiers survived because of his actions. He never calculated how many hours his sabotage had bought. He simply did what seemed right at the time and then returned to farming when the war ended. That humility was characteristic of his generation. The people who fought and resisted during World War II rarely spoke in grand terms about their contributions. They did what needed to be done, survived if they were lucky, and returned to their ordinary lives afterward. The heroic narratives and historical analysis came later, constructed by people who had not been there and who tried to make sense of chaos by organizing it into comprehensible patterns. But war is not comprehensible. It is chaos and terror and impossible decisions made under pressure. It is ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances and forced to choose between their safety and their principles. Some choose safety. Some choose principles. Kuiper chose principles. That choice cost him his farm, nearly cost him his life, and bought time measured in hours. In the years after the war, Kuiper rebuilt his farm and resumed his life. The Netherlands recovered from occupation. The damage from Operation Market Garden was repaired. Arnhem Bridge, which had been the focus of so much fighting and sacrifice, was rebuilt. Life returned to normal, or as normal as life can be after occupation and war. Kuiper's children asked him about September 1944. He told them the story, but always emphasized that he was not special. Anyone would have done the same. He was just the one who happened to be in the right place at the right time. His wife disagreed. She told the children that their father had been terrified that night, that he had known he was likely to be caught and killed, but he had done it anyway. That was what made him special. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. When Kuiper died in 1968, his funeral was attended by British veterans who travelled from England to pay their respects. They had not known him during the war. They had only learned of his actions years later when researchers documented civilian resistance during Operation Market Garden. But they came anyway because they understood that their survival had depended on countless people like Kuiper who did small things that added up to something larger. The story of Martinus Kuiper endures not because it is unique, but because it represents something universal about human courage. Wars are decided by soldiers and generals and industrial capacity and technological advantage. But wars are also decided by farmers who sabotage supply crates, by housewives who hide refugees, by clerks who forge identity papers, by children who carry messages. The unglamorous, undocumented, often fatal acts of resistance that occur in occupied territories. Kuiper's farm still exists. It is still worked by his descendants. The fields where German soldiers assembled in September 1944 now grow crops in peace. The barn where Kuiper tampered with ammunition crates was rebuilt and houses dairy cows. The land remembers nothing, only people remember. And as the generation that fought World War II dies out, the memories become stories, and the stories become history. This is one of those stories. A story of one farmer, 3,000 soldiers, and 3 days in September 1944, when the impossible happened because an ordinary man refused to accept that his choices did not matter. Remember Martinus Josephus Kuiper. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act when action is dangerous. Remember that ordinary people can change the course of battles, not through military skill, but through moral clarity and stubborn determination. Remember that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but the willingness of one person to say no, to refuse cooperation, to disrupt the machinery of oppression in whatever small ways are available. Remember that those small disruptions, when multiplied across thousands of people and hundreds of occupied towns, become the resistance that makes conquest unsustainable and occupation unbearable. Remember the farmer who stood alone against 3,000 soldiers, not because he was trained for it, not because he thought he would succeed, but simply because, when the moment came, he chose to fight in the only way he could. That choice mattered. Those 3,000 soldiers were delayed. That delay bought time. That time saved lives. In the grand sweep of World War II, with its 50 million dead and its world-changing consequences, one farmer's sabotage seems almost too small to mention. But wars are not won by grand gestures alone. They are won by the accumulation of small victories, small delays, small acts of courage that individually seem insignificant, but collectively become overwhelming. Martinus Kuiper's 3 days in September 1944 were one of those small acts. His story deserves to be remembered because it reminds us that no one is powerless, that everyone has choices, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by armies, but by individuals who refuse to surrender their humanity to tyranny. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.